Thank you all so much for coming. I thought I'd kick the panel off just by asking all the panelists just to introduce themselves, if you don't already know them, and just tell us quickly how they first got started in Swift. So I'll go to the guys you already know.
So Chris Bailey, IBM, doing runtime development, contributing mostly to Swift.org. So I've done contributions to Swift, XC Test, Swift Package Manager, Foundation, but mostly Dispatch. So most of the work I've been doing has been getting Dispatch running to do concurrency into Foundation and exploited by the APIs on top of it, so people like Ian can use it in Katura. So how did I get started in Swift? Well, I'm paid to do it, which is kind of nice. So it was a conversation with my, as they call it in IBM, distinguished engineer, who said, we're starting to do this. We need someone who wants to work on the runtime and has some background in it. So that was me.
Hi, I'm Ian Partridge, also from IBM. So my background was in Java development and support. I was looking for a new opportunity. There was a new Swift at IBM organization starting up. So I jumped at the chance to learn something completely new. Since then, I've been also working in open source, some contributions to Foundation, but more recently, I've been mainly working on the Katura web framework.
Awesome. I'm Yvette Cook. I'm an iOS developer at Novoda. I first got started with Swift slightly under duress. I was working at a startup writing Objective-C. I did a side project with a friend who was an Android developer. He point blank refused to write anything in Objective-C. So we were left with Swift. But I'm now lucky enough to write in it full time, which I absolutely love.
Hi, I'm Dan Cutting. I've been doing iOS since around 2008, mostly at Sky. Done a lot of the Sky apps, the good ones. They were good back in the day. Obviously, there was no Swift back then. I moved to another company called Livedrive and went to WWDC. So I was in the room when Swift was announced, which was awesome. And I went back to work and started sneaking it into the iOS apps. So that's how I got into it.
Awesome.
I'm Abizer Nasir. I'm a iOS and OS 10 contractor. I've been doing it full time since about 2010. I was in the alt conf room when Swift was announced in 2014, and I've known from experience that when Apple announce something, it's really something you need to get onto because they tend to go in the future. So I think about 6 months after Swift came out, even though I was working on Objective-C, I was approached with a new contract to help a team that had started writing an app in Swift, but they got stuck. So I was sort of hired to sort of mentor them and develop the app because although Swift is nice, it's a great language, the real pain point most people feel is trying to deal with the actually making apps with it and the SDK, which is something that all of us who've been working in Objective-C know how to do.
Cool. As you all may have noticed, there's something exciting happening behind me. Here you can submit questions and upvote ones you would like the panel to answer. You can visit slido.com /SwiftLDN. People on the live stream as well submit questions, and you have a voice in the room. We're first going to kick off with a topic that Dan wanted to discuss. So do you want to introduce it? The panel will discuss it, and then we'll open to questions from the screen.
Sure. So next week, obviously, is WWDC, and it's always a fun time to sort of predict what might be coming out. Obviously, now with Swift being open source since December, we have a lot more information than we would in most years. So it's maybe not as fun because we know more than we did. But I'm wondering, has anyone got any thoughts? What might be coming up? What people like to see at WW?
I think Swift refactoring would definitely be my top one. Can we have a woo? Is there any woos for Swift refactoring? I'll pass them on to Apple. I'm sure they're watching.
Everyone wants Swift refactoring. Everyone keeps asking me this at work as well, and I've got no idea. But if you look at the invitation, it's very sort of dark theme with like multicolored code. I think there's going to be some big changes to Xcode coming. Maybe a separate IDE for Swift. It seems very much like it. It's got to be more than just a new typeface or a new coloring. Maybe a dark mode for OS 10. Maybe some cross-platform, maybe more cross-platform integration between iOS and OS 10 and the desktop. Consolidating the frameworks, and much more Swiftier Objective-C APIs. I mean, we're seeing it with libdispatch. I only found that out last week, and it looks amazing. You know, I had some code that I had to tidy it up and I had to dump it because I thought it's not no point doing it. So yeah, basically, there's the changes in the main frameworks to support Swift is what I'm looking forward to.
Awesome. How about you guys? Obviously, the iOS stuff is of much less interest to you, at least. But yeah, is there anything you guys are really hoping to see or looking forward to seeing?
So I'm actually going to WWDC for the first time. It's going to be the first time going to a conference called anything to do with iOS. So it's going to be just all interesting for me to see a completely new ecosystem. We're coming completely from the server side and from other languages. So yeah, for me, I think everything's going to be interesting.
I'm not going. I'm really sad.
We can come along to our party. Swift London. Does anyone from the room have any questions? And then we'll move on to the exciting thing happening behind me. No? Al?
Do you reckon it's too soon that Apple will release some sort of framework based on Swift, but they'd probably wait until Swift 3 or further? It's still going to be all Objective-C framework.
So the question was, are Apple going to release any frameworks that are actually written in Swift, or does the panel think it's too soon for that?
Well, probably not at DubDub, I don't think. But obviously, as we get closer to the Swift 3 release, when things are actually stabilizing, we might see more stuff coming out at that point. It's unlikely we're not going to get a Swift 3 at WWDC. It's going to be near the end of the year. And because that has some major breaking changes in the source, it seems a bit premature to do much else. It's quite interesting, the changes that were announced for Swift 3, or the Swift 3 release originally had a lot more stuff in it than it now does. So I think about 2 or 3 weeks ago, Chris Latner posted a post saying, sorry guys, basically. And we're postponing things like ABI stability, generics, completion of generics and things like that, which are obviously...
On the generic.
Yeah, I mean, that's the interesting bit, I think. ABI stability, I don't think it affects many people, although I would love to hear the server side, how does ABI stability affect you guys?
Yeah, I find the whole ABI stability one kind of an interesting thing because so Swift package management is all about download, compile from source. So if you're having to build and compile your entire project from source, you don't really need ABI compatibility. You only need that if you're linking to existing libraries. So in some ways, I'm kind of surprised that they're seeing it as a priority. Now, at the same time, we've been arguing in Swift package management that you need the ability to link to existing libraries which are potentially written in Swift. And at the moment, that's not something that's it's not something that's on the roadmap. They're saying it may happen, it's some way down the line. So it's kind of strange that unless you're linking to binaries, you don't need ABI compatibility. Their current story is all source build, so I'm not convinced it's a problem at the moment.
Yeah, so earlier on when I pushed or tried to push directly to Bluemix, you'd have noticed it was compiling directly from source every time I did a CF push. And that's the model that's certainly planned for IBM's platform as a service for now.
I'm just wondering, then why do we think it is actually a priority for Chris Latner? I mean, he said it's the top priority thing for Swift 4, basically. So, yeah.
I think a big part of it is to ship those Swift libraries and to ship Swift internal code from Apple, which is very hard to do until they have API stability.
External closed source libraries.
External closed source libraries as well, but the reason they care is about their own libraries and being able to use Swift.
I think a lot of the reason developers care about it. Some of the reasons, a lot of the reason I've heard for people saying it is like they have to ship these humongous integrate libraries in their apps every time. Big deal. I mean, I think I read it a while ago that they're quite large, and everyone's sort of complaining about the size of the binaries, but apparently those things are bitcode enabled, even if you don't enable bitcode, so you only really download the bits you need of them. I've read that somewhere. But to answer the actual question about Swift-only frameworks, if you've ever tried to write Swift code that works with Objective-C, you'll know that all the stuff that you want to do to work doesn't work. You haven't got the nice type system, you haven't got the enums, the proper, raw enums and stuff like that, so it doesn't really work. And I don't really see them doing a hack job just to get it to work rather than waiting until they can do it properly.
Let's take a question from the stream. So the top question is Xcode a good IDE to use Katura? If not, what would you suggest?
So yes, you can absolutely develop Katura apps in Xcode, although it's worth bearing in mind that if you're trying to do a front end and a back end and ship an app to the App Store, currently you can only ship Swift 2.2 apps to the App Store until Swift 3 is released, and Katura is tracking Swift 3 development. So there's a mismatch there at the moment, but once Swift 3 is released, that will go away. But yeah, absolutely, you can develop Katura apps in Xcode.
I suppose it links to maybe a question of what would you like to see improved in Xcode? Is there anything that would be brilliant to change in order to make it a great tool to write server-side Swift? You look like you've got something to say.
Emacs, basically. There is an Emacs mode. I mean, there is a Swift mode for Emacs, not the one that ships from Apple, which is weird, but there's one that comes from Melpa or Marmalade, whichever one you choose. That's quite good. But what you get with Emacs is really great find and replace, really great sort of navigation. What you get with Xcode is code completion. Anything you try and do to code completion for Emacs really makes it fall over. Yeah, you can do stuff with source kitten and stuff like that, but it's just all hacky. So if I'm writing SPM stuff, I'll just use Emacs and bite my lip and just try and remember what the codes are. But really, I'd like to see. I mean, you get Emacs bindings in Xcode, but I want to see more Emacsy Xcode. Some people want to see more Vimy Xcode. I don't know.
We'll save that debate for another day, maybe. Next question. Will the Swift Package Manager replace tools like CocoaPod and Carthage?
So I think it was really interesting that Apple decided that they wanted to have a Swift Package Manager, because there is obviously an existing ecosystem out there around CocoaPods and Carthage. Have you got anything to add on that, Chris? I'm not. So Swift Package Manager is never going to be able to replace those because it doesn't support Objective-C. So there's absolutely going to be a place for both. But I think the strategic future for shipping your Swift code is definitely the Swift Package Manager, and that's what IBM is interested in. I showed you the Swift Package Catalog earlier. That's directly looking at GitHub projects which implement support for the Swift Package Manager.
Yeah, I would say that's absolutely Apple's long-term intent, is that it builds an ecosystem for packages for Swift, and it will eventually replace Carthage and CocoaPods for that specific task. Now, that's not what it does today, because Swift Package Management today is just a build system, right? It doesn't locate the packages, it doesn't, well, it does pull them down, but you have to put the Git URL in. So really, it's just a build system today. But it does strike me that, yeah, the long term is a package curation system, etc., to replace CocoaPods and Carthage for Swift.
As you can imagine, I've got a bit to say about this. I'd actually like to see Carthage and CocoaPods go away. There's no reason to have a third-party support to find this sort of stuff. It's great that they're there, and you're right, there are times when you don't need to use it. I'd like to see Xcode actually support a file structure that supports the Swift Package Manager straight out from creating a new project, rather than have to mung around with files yourself at the moment. I also think it's really weird that they've pushed, 2 years ago, they said, yeah, it's great, we've got dynamic frameworks on iOS, like we've had on the desktop for ages. And then they make the Swift Package Manager, which is, oh no, we just build everything as a library because performance. When they figure that one out, I think it'll be a lot easier. But you have to realize that the Swift Package Manager and the work that IBM is doing sort of adds on top of it isn't about discoverability, isn't about quality, isn't about a community. It's basically, here's your stuff, put it in. And that's a lot of what Carthage is. CocoaPods is about the community, about discoverability, about rating each other up, about having an ecosystem. And those questions aren't answered by the Swift Package Manager, even with external tools. They really aren't. It's still just an external tool, depending on what you put into it. So I'd like to see it go away, but I think there is still a case for external package management, and for Carthage and for CocoaPods.
Do you think we're going to see more community input? I mean, obviously the open source Swift, do you think that they will start to bring in more, just basically upvoting, for example, on on packages and seeing if those are...
No.
You've
I mean,
not.
it's Apple. They're not going to have any sort of any official third-party way of people sort of saying something about external code. It's really not going to happen with them. They're not going to have, well, here's the Swift package manager that we're managing, and you can all vote on it, and it's on our site. I don't see it happening.
Interesting.
So is that something you'd be interested in for the package catalogue then?
Yeah, because that's...
Do we have another
I can
mic?
talk loudly. I think that is part of the vibrant ecosystem that's grown around CocoaPods, is the fact that you have a very dedicated team of very intelligent people creating tools around finding third-party code, and recently providing metrics of testability, of how many people use it, of having clean structure, but they have linting built into CocoaPods. All this stuff, which isn't part of anything that Apple provides at the moment, which forms a community, which forms community standards around it, which is the good thing, and I think is needed and can be supported externally.
I think being able to see the test coverage of a package would be incredibly valuable to be able to start to assess, and also see that support behind testing that I think has been lacking potentially from Apple.
Yeah, so if you look at almost every single successful language, it has some form of package system. And the more successful ones have a form of discoverability. They have things like badges for code coverage. They talk about, how many builds are actually running. They link into Travis CI, etc. And these are all really valuable things. And I think you're right. Apple needs to allow the community to build this stuff, because it's about community packages, it's about community input. So the community has to build it. And all Apple really has to do is sit back and let us do it. And yeah, I mean, it's required, and I think it'll happen.
But what, I don't know if I want to beat this anymore, but if you have a centralized source of like, here are all the packages are, then you'll end up with a problem like Node, the NPM had recently. With somebody, with name collisions and all the rest of it, where you don't really have name collisions on the Swift package manager if you just say, I want this URL. It can be called the same thing as any one of a dozen other URLs, but I want this one. You can't have that with you'll have to have some sort of namespacing if you have a central official package manager.
We can continue this discussion at the pub later. The next question, static versus dynamic languages, discuss.
Can I just say that was a joke?
I really wanted to talk about that one.
They've not got emoji support for this. Okay, well, does anybody want to comment on that, or shall we just move swiftly on? Boom! Pop! Sorry. This is all your fault.
So,
I'm surprised you want to talk about it.
well, so I have the advantage that I've never programmed in Objective-C, right? So the whole Objective-C versus Swift, static versus dynamic, I can't comment on, so you can't shoot me for that. I can comment more on characteristics of languages in general, right? And one of the advantage of static languages is they're faster, right? So static languages are always faster, because when it comes to compilation, I know exactly what my variables are, and I know exactly how to handle them, and I can do it in the minimum number of instructions. There is no lookup of what type is this, or how is it being used, and I can dispatch directly to functions without having to do any indirection to do lookup. So static languages are always faster, and they're always smaller, because I need less instructions to deal with everything. So there are inherent advantages to static languages.
And we'll leave it there. We've recently shipped an app for a client in Swift 2.2. Is Free going to break everything, or is it just minor formatting?
It's not going to break everything. It's going to break most things. So Swift 3 is going to be a major source breaking change. Apple's going to mitigate that through fix-its in Xcode, but the fix-its won't fix everything. You will definitely have to fix up some of your code manually by hand. If you've been tracking Swift 3 development, you'll see that one of the things that has changed recently is how iteration over collections works. So they're prepared to change some pretty fundamental things at this stage. But a lot of the minor syntactic sugar type stuff will be handled automatically through Xcode.
Yes, it will break a lot of source stuff. The idea is that this is the last big breaking change for source, and hopefully. So that Swift 4 and so on will be source compatible. So it's a good time to do it. It's true that Fixits will be able to fix a lot of the actual problems, but I think the bigger thing is because we've now got the API design guidelines, which are fairly detailed and fairly opinionated about how you should write Swift, like idiomatic Swift function calls and things like this. So even if you can automatically fix a lot of your code, it won't look like idiomatic Swift necessarily. So you will need to go, and if you care about that stuff, you will need to go and fix a lot of that.
As a contractor, can I say I hope so? The little bits of code I have had to change, the Fixits have done an amazing job. But what we have been doing at work recently is we're trying to, where possible, write Swift 3 compatible code, which means writing enums with lowercase letters, bracketing closures differently. You start doing that now, it'll save trouble.
Doubling every parameter, first parameter.
Yeah, but that's more call aside rather than, and you can fix that later, because it goes away. Tests. Yeah, write your tests. You'll have to rewrite your tests, obviously, but at least you have some idea what your tests are. You're on your way to doing it.
Amen to that. Next question. I get that IBM is looking for a modern server-side language that they can have some input into, but why Swift and not Go or Rust?
I don't know. It's a good question, right? There's three potential languages. I think one part of it is, I don't know if it's still true, but certainly 3-4 months ago, IBM had the single biggest Swift development shop in the world. Right? All of our mobile applications that we create, both through our business services for third-party clients that IBM uses itself or that we sell, all use Swift. So we already used it a hell of a lot ourselves, and that gives us a fair amount of buy-in in choosing a server-side language. Right? It's one that we are already using and that we already have a large pool of developers that we're using themselves.
I think Chris had a slide about this earlier, when he was talking about the ability to write in the same language for the front end and the back end. There's a huge pool of iOS developers out there who are native client developers. And that's slightly an untapped resource. So I think that's definitely one reason why IBM's interested in mobile first and Swift.
Just touching on something you said earlier in your talk, Swift is a fast language and a small language, and obviously that's something that Apple and Chris Lattner in particular is valuing. Being able to write very fast, statically compiled, small code. A lot of people, I think, have asked in the community, why is that a priority for app development? And why have we got a language like Swift for app development? Why do we care that we can write code on the server? Is it such a big deal that iOS developers should be able to write server-side code?
Well, I think every app eventually needs to talk to some sort of back end, whether it's going to talk directly to some service. You want to provide login, you want to provide storing of user data. Apple provides CloudKit, but is that everything? No, I don't think it is. So there's definitely space for Swift on the server side to solve some of these problems, right?
Use JavaScript with CloudKit if you want to use it. I think you need to use JavaScript with CloudKit.
Do you?
I think so, yeah. Question I wanted to, I don't know if you finished. Yeah. Sorry, the question I want to ask is, as someone who's a complete duffer at web stuff, I mean, I've done some Sinatra, which that looks a lot similar to, but you do it and then you forget about it because you're just not using it all the time. Is it the sort of thing that, as somebody who needs to touch upon web development once in a while, you can just sort of dive in, write something in a language that you're very comfortable with and just have it work well rather than having people who write HTML laugh at you?
So this is one of the key goals for Kitura, that it will be easy for people with existing Swift skills to pick it up and immediately get a web server up and running, and if they want to deploy that to the cloud. So it was absolutely designed with that in mind, and also the decision to that the framework should be inspired by Express for Node.js was because we know that there's a large existing pool of developers out there who have used Express for Node.js and are familiar with that model of how a web framework should be architected. So yeah, absolutely, that's one of the driving forces behind the design.
it's fair to say that in Ian's demo, I hope it came across that basically the framework of getting a URL up and running is only about 4 or 5 lines of code. So we still think that that's too much. Right? Ideally, it should get down to the point that the scaffolding's all been built for you. Right? We can provide a server-side component that connects to your client. So you have an API that you run in the client that will connect to the server. You just give it credentials of where it is, and you can start running code on the server. And then you just have to implement what you want there, whether it's storing user credentials in a database. And the database connector should be there. You should just be saying, from the client, I want to store this, and it needs to go into a couch database or MySQL or whatever, and I need a server component to act as a gateway for that database because it needs to have credentials and login information. I don't want to store that in my client application. So our aim is to make the server side so simple that you should only have to write 10, 15 lines of code, and it's going to be in the language you know.
But where this starts to get really interesting is where you can start to integrate your backend with services, right? So one of the things that Bluemix provides is a catalog of services which your backend can talk to. Things like getting data directly from the Twitter Decahose, things like talking to cognitive APIs from Watson, things like text-to-speech, speech-to-text, sort of powerful APIs that you'll be able to plug your backend into and then expose that down to the mobile application.
Awesome. We'll move on to the next question. Apple make out that Swift is great for all problems, which smells of, I'm guessing there's a missing emoji there. What is Swift not well suited for? Go ahead, Dan.
Well, I mean, this is sort of what my question was. Is this really the best language for app development? There has been a lot of complaint recently about dynamism in the language, which means a lot of things, right? It could mean reflection or dynamic typing or dynamic runtimes or, who knows really what people really want from a dynamic language. It's obviously really good at low-level things like, it's been talked about using it, in very, very small embedded devices and things like that. That's great. Can you have a language which is all things to all problems? I don't know. It seems like Swift is pretty close, in my opinion. But I don't know.
I'm not a computer scientist, so I don't know. I've used some of the dynamic stuff in Swift. I think I wrote one open source thing which used Objective-C associated objects. Did I need to? In that case, yes, but I wouldn't normally use stuff like that because as a contractor I don't want to go in and write over clever code that nobody else can maintain. Also, when Swift came out, part of why I was so excited about it was that I'd been learning Haskell for a couple of years before then, and that's a purely functional language, and people do amazing stuff with that. They don't worry about the dynamism. Also, I find that, this is probably a canonical example, but it is true, if you're trying to write tests, the sort of test you have to write for Swift code is a lot simpler than the sort of test you have to write for Objective-C code.
What do you know about that?
It's just that whole type thing. You just know what the type is. So if you can generate a struct with those types, you don't have to test a load of stuff based around it. It's just,
you don't have to test that your function could get any sort of...
Yeah, it takes that, and that can do that, because it conforms to that protocol. And so that's all it can do. That's all you need to test for, really.
That said, testing in Swift is also a bit tricky, mocking and things like that.
Pass the mic.
Sorry, I was just saying, mocking in Swift, for example, is a problem at the moment. There are solutions like, I think there's a project called Cuckoo, which lets you generate stubs, mock stubs, but it's done through code generation, which, fine, that works. But I guess that's a problem that Swift is not going to solve very well.
Dynamic code is just not what it's done for.
I think another thing that's going to be very interesting to see is how easy Swift is to learn. I think if it can be a language which people can pick up as a first language, that will be a fantastic way to introduce people to it early on. I know at the moment in universities, Python's used a lot to introduce people to computer science. If Swift can fill that role too, I think it'd be very interesting to see.
I think I think from what I've heard, that's personally interesting to Chris Latner. He really wants to pitch it as a language for education. And I think they've already partnered with some universities for developing courses teaching Swift as a first programming language. I think to me, Swift is treading this very careful path where it's got the whole difference between value types and reference types. It doesn't take a strong opinion on those with having classes and structs. It's low level, but with sort of high level expressive type syntax. It lets you write functional APIs, so the Haskell guys quite like it. Guys and girls, sorry. So I think it is a really interesting language that so far they're managing to tread the path and keeping most people happy most of the time.
And I think freeing it from Xcode to some extent so people can run it on any computer. I've run workshops for people getting started with Swift, and it's a major, major barrier that people have to have a MacBook to do it. It's a high barrier. And things like the sandbox is a fantastic way to start bringing it out to other people.
It's interesting that we see a peak in usage of the sandbox on one particular day of the week, and it turns out that it is actually being used by a university as part of their coursework. So during the class, we actually get a surge in usage. The other interesting thing is that one of the highest client platforms that's using it is actually Windows. So the vast majority of people using the sandbox is on Windows, which, when you start to think about it, isn't as surprising. You know, if you're on Mac, you can use Xcode. If you're on Linux, you can now actually do it. If you're on Windows, you can't. But yes, I mean, it's starting to open it up. But for me, there needs to be good IDE support on other platforms. You know, at the moment, there is quite a buy-in to be a Swift developer because you have to buy a Mac, and those aren't cheap. So if we want to really open Swift to as big a set of developers as possible, we need to have good IDEs on other platforms. So FOSDEM, one of the big conferences in Europe, free and open source, they actually gave some statistics on attendees and what devices they were using to connect to the Wi-Fi. So if you look at just laptops, only about a third of them were Macs. The rest of them were Linux and Windows desktop laptops. So that basically says if we can bring Swift with a good IDE to other platforms, you can potentially triple the developer ecosystem for it.
Awesome. Next question. Can you elaborate a bit more on the changes in bridging and Swift 3.0? No? Yes?
So there was some posts on the mailing list where they're talking about really two sets of changes. The first is the removal of implicit bridging, where bridging just works, and replacing it with explicit bridging, so you'll have to actually write code to bridge, which you already have to do on Linux.
You might need to explain what bridging is. I don't know.
Well, it's being able to use Objective-C looking objects in Swift seamlessly. On Linux, you either have to do an as or you have to do a .bridge. So they're looking at removing it, which sounds counterintuitive and it sounds like a regression. But I think there's two reasons for it. The first is because they're going to replace it with actual Swift APIs, so you won't need to do bridging. And I think the second is that there is a performance impact to bridging in the way that it's done today. So being able to remove that and make it explicit, the performance when bridging is happening will be much better, and they'll hide that under the covers of the Swift APIs, which will actually come in. So basically, you shouldn't have to do bridging anyway. There should just be a Swift API. And I think that's why they're doing it.
Cool. I'll move on to another question. On a different note, what frameworks do you prefer for unit testing in Swift?
I'll go first, just XC-test. I mean, there are other ones. I've used Kiwi before. I've used Spectre and Expector. I've used Quick and Nimble. But really, just drop it to XC-test. It's a lot simpler.
Yeah, I'd agree with that. I was a big Kiwi fan in the Objective-C days, but I haven't stuck with it. I think XC-test is fine. You can't do that much more anyway. So
I think it works with the SPM as well now, doesn't it?
It does, yeah. Yeah, you can now run your tests as part of a build or part of using the Swift package manager, which is pretty cool.
Yep. I'm very much the same, XC-test and UI test as well.
Yeah, we use XC-test a lot internally. All our Katura tests are based on XC-test. And of course, it's worth remembering that's what Apple are using for Foundation as well. So the open source Foundation, all the tests are on top of XC-test.
Cool. Another question, going back to WWDC, Siri API, discuss. Does anyone have rumours, opinions, hopes, dreams?
I don't have much to say about this, but I was looking through the WWDC app, and there is a session in there. Like, most of them are hidden sessions, right? There's about 113 sessions, I think, and about 35 or something are real sessions, and the rest are just fake names. And one of the names is Siri question, what is it? Like as in calling a Siri constructor with a parameter, what is it? You can read into that what you like. It sounds like it's time for it, I think. It's been so long. There's been no love for Siri for so long. And I used to think it was just because it's such a hard thing to do, to write a good API for this kind of thing, but that's clearly not the case. We've got things like Alexa and Google Assistant and things like this, which are doing a good job of it.
Yeah. I hope I'm not going to be proven wrong on YouTube in 2 weeks' time. But I think there was some interesting blogs talking about the poem that was appearing on the front page of the WWDC website. It was a series of things that you could potentially ask Siri. So it was call me an Uber, book me a restaurant. Not quite as explicit as that, but it seems to be a heavy hint. And I think it's something that would be a good response to the announcements made at Google I/O, where they're very heavily pushing the Google Assistant, and I think Apple will be seen to respond to that. But hey, if in 2 weeks' time that's not true, if someone could edit this out, that would be great.
If you've used an Apple TV, you know how amazing it is to just be able to talk to your box and actually have it listen to you rather than just yelling at it like I normally do. But Apple are very big in accessibility. I mean, can you imagine what a boon having a voice interface would be for accessibility? And you know Tim Cook's into it, you know Apple have historically been into it, and you know historically we've been really bad at doing it. Maybe if you have a reason to, we'll do better. But I think it will certainly bring a lot of benefit to a lot of people.
Awesome. We'll go back to a Katura question. What's the main reason behind creating it from scratch instead of evolving some existing frameworks?
Well, when we started working on Katura, there were no existing frameworks. There's been this sort of flowering of interest in server-side Swift and a whole bunch of different projects starting up. I think a few startups as well. So the short answer is because they didn't exist at that time. But I do think it's interesting to look at the different paths that some of them are taking. And Chris might have some comments on this as well. But certainly for something as basic as concurrency, there's a whole variety of different approaches being taken. Some of these server-side frameworks are directly calling through to pthreads. Some are using Grand Central Dispatch like us. There's another which is using a Go-style concurrency library called libmil. So in a way, you can look at this and say, oh, why are all these people reinventing the same wheel? But actually, when you look under the covers of what they're doing, they're taking quite radically different approaches. So I think as time moves on, as these things evolve, I think there's a lot of value in having a really a broad ecosystem of people experimenting, taking new approaches, and we'll see what happens over the long term. But there's certainly room for more than one, right?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, as I said, I think I'm aware of about 10 different web frameworks at the moment, and that's really good for a burgeoning ecosystem, because we've chosen our way of doing it, but it almost certainly is not going to be the best way, and you need experimentation to work out what is the right way for Swift. Now, the fact that Katura copies Express, which copies Ruby Sinatra, which copies, it's a whole chain of, basically one framework being replicated everywhere. Now, that's great for those languages, but it might not be the right thing for Swift. And we're more interested in seeing Swift being successful on the server than having our framework win. So the more there are in the early days, the more interest that drives, because people don't leave the language because they say, well, it doesn't work in a way that I like. I can't program to this. It's not, a way that looks and feels good to me. So the more choice there is, the more people it brings in, the more we'll actually learn what's the right thing for Swift.
I'm curious, for you guys, what would make you decide to use one framework over the other?
If we're talking about web services and things like that, then I really like the web machine approach from Erlang, where it's got the whole sort of state system baked into it. You don't have to do very much to get very, very correct web server behavior. Whereas frameworks like Sinatra, for example, you really have to try to make sure that you handle all the different possibilities. You have to sort of model all that state transition yourself. Because HTTP is extremely complex. It's not as simple as it looks at first glance. Yeah, the web machine flowchart it's amazing. You blow it up like this, and you still can't see all the text. So being able to just not worry about any of that and just override the little tiny pieces you need to do is the kind of framework I would like to see.
Abizer, any thoughts?
Easy to deploy, but I mean, the one time I had to write some Node, as you well know, it was just a case of writing it and deploying it to Heroku. If it's that easy with Bluemix as it seems to be, and it's priced right, it's a no-brainer. I don't want to have to go fiddling around and setting up my own instances or Dockers, because it's just not what I do. If I need to do it for myself or for a small company, I just want to have it as simple as possible. Maybe larger teams would have a different thing, but for me, just ease of deployment would be the key.
Yeah, the same for me for side projects. It would definitely be: is the community there? Are the tutorials there? To be honest, because we all are starting from scratch to some extent, and if there are good explanations, easy access to answers, that absolutely can make a framework so much easier to pick up. I think that is time to wrap up and time to go to the pub. Do we have any closing thoughts? No, we are thoughted out, I think. Any thoughts from you guys? Awesome. Well, thank you all very much for sending your questions. Thank you to the live stream for bearing with us. And yeah, to the pub. I imagine Morgan has some instructions as to where we should go.
Take the mic. I've got a hot potato here.